In this video I'm going to try my hand at a little scratch building. I had this rattle gun left over from the Fujimi tool set that I thought would be cool to have a compressor to go with. So for a compressor I'm going to need to build some kind of air tank, a compressor housing with some cooling fins on, some kind of motor housing that's slightly smaller, and then a fan / drive belt arrangement at the back. So for the tank I thought these two empty paint bottles would be good if I cut the dropper end off and then slice the bottoms and join them on the bottom and slightly overlap it so that it's not too long. I think that should work. So I grab the multi-tool, slice the ends off, then slice the bottoms off, gave the bottoms a clean up with a sanding stick, then dunked them in some warm soapy water to get rid of the paint wrapper around the top. So once they were dry it was just a case of gluing them together. The plastic on this had gone surprisingly soft and rubbery. I don't know if that's because it's designed to hold paint or not, but filing a smooth edge was a bit of a pain. But I just kept turning them until I found a place where they joined together well, and then put a bit of tape on to hold it whilst it dried. Then I took some Humbrol modelling filler and just smoothed over the edge where they joined. For the top deck I had this piece of I-beam left over, and I just scored the edges on one side and then chopped it off with a pair of snips. Once that was done, it was just a case of laying it on a piece of sanding paper and smoothing off the worst of the rough edge. Then to make the compressor housing, I took some scraps of styrene that were kicking around and cut them into strips, and then turned those strips into squares. You can also see on the right that I made some of those squares in half. Then it was just a case of layering them up, going with a square and then a spacer and then a square until I'd built up the housing that I wanted. Once it was all together and dry, I grabbed the multi-tool with a sanding drum and just smoothed off the sides and rounded over the corners. Then onto the top I just cut some small strips out of one of the squares, took the sanding drum and did a little bit of shaping to them, glued them onto the top to act as the top fins. Then to finish off the air tank, I cut some circles out of that styrene scrap and glued them on the ends to cover the holes where the dropper bottle top was. I then grabbed some standard milliput and mixed up a small amount with my fingers and shaped it into the base of the compressor housing, stuck it on a spare piece of styrene just to check that it was the size and shape that I wanted, and then got a second piece of milliput and turned it into the rough shape of the motor housing. Using the offcuts from the top deck, I made these two little legs or support pieces for the bottom, put a dab of CA glue on and then pushed the tank onto, and a little bit more glue on the deck itself, and that went on the top. Once it was all dry, I threw it in the paint booth for a quick blast of Mecha White Primer. Then off camera I sanded that back just to get it a little bit tidier and smoother. I didn't want it perfect because I'm going for a sort of old workshop kind of diorama. I had some TS52 Candy Lime Green kicking around in my paint can stash. I just gave it 2 light coats because that's all that was left in the can, and I thought that would work quite well for this. While I was waiting for the paint to dry, the milliput was ready and I grabbed the sanding drum and just did a little bit of shaping on the bottom of the compressor housing. just to give it a little bit more of a definite shape. Once I was happy with it, I took some Vallejo metallic black and just gave it a quick brush coat. These kind of casings are always rough cast, so I'm not worried about having a perfectly smooth paint finish. For the top of the compressor I used metallic gunmetal, again with a brush because I wanted texture and variation. For the assembly where the fan and the drive belt is, I wasn't sure what to do because I couldn't really make a wire mesh. So I drew some circles on a piece of styrene, roughly connected them up, scored them out with a knife, and then chopped it out with a pair of snips. I had a piece of this meshing left over from the bumper from a model kit that I built a little while ago, and I thought if I took it and glued it on both sides, that would give the impression of wire meshing without having to build a really intricate wire mesh. Taking a brush, I just scrubbed in some of the metallic black Vallejo paint just to tie it all together. When all the paint was dry, it was just a case of sticking it all together with some more CA glue. I found this little box piece in my box of spares and I stuck that on top of the motor housing and painted that in the gunmetal as well. I just used a piece of sprue for the air pipe and cut it to size and painted it with bright brass Vallejo paint. All that's left to do was put everything together and see how it looked. So small amounts of CA glue and build everything up on the deck. First the compressor housing, then the air pipe, then the motor casing. I also found this little side tank piece in my box of spares and thought that would work quite well. I made this little air valve out of just some of the offcuts from sprue and styrene as I've been building things, so I glued that on the end. Then I went to put the fan backplate assembly thing on and I realised I needed to add a couple of support struts, so I just cut them out of sprue and you can see them here, and then it was just a case of gluing the fan plate onto that. Then my leftover piece of hose from the Fujimi kit I wrapped around my knife handle just to give it the coiled shape of an airline, and then attach that to the rattle gun. And there's the result. I'm still only a beginner modeler and I've not really scratch built much before. If I rebuild this in the future, I've got a couple ideas of how to do it better. I think the air pipe could be a little bit smaller, and I think the top deck could have done with some wiring laying on it before I glued everything down. But like I said, once it's weathered, I think it'll be fine. So for now, I'll see you in the next one.